A single Roman man, in a fleeting moment of whim, could buy a girl for the price of a pair of shoes, and then, within hours, decide whether she would live as a servant in his kitchen, a commodity in his bed, or a body secretly thrown beyond the city walls. In ancient Rome, slavery was not merely a labor system. It was a complete mechanism to slowly crush a human being, especially a woman. Before we dive into one of the darkest and most brutal chapters of history, if you are interested in uncovering truths erased from the ancient past, hit like and subscribe now, because what you will hear today is not what school textbooks or light documentaries usually tell. In the 1st century BCE, the streets of Rome teemed with military parades. Every new victory meant one certain thing: the influx of thousands of captives into the slave markets. Men, elders, children, and women. When a city was crushed beneath the feet of Roman legions, soldiers were not merely after gold and grain, they sought bodies. Women were dragged from the ruins, from burning houses, from beneath the corpses of their husbands and fathers. From the moment chains were fastened around their necks, a woman lost her name, her family, her past, and became merely a head in a trader's ledger. Caravans marched for days, sometimes weeks, toward Rome or major cities. Barefoot women, forced to walk under the scorching sun, were whipped if they slowed, left to die if they fell. Many arrived at the markets with fevered bodies or spirits broken long before their enslavement had truly begun. And in the marketplace, the real chapter of terror began. Women were stripped completely before buyers, not for medical reasons, but to display the merchandise without deceit. The trader would open the girl's mouth to check her teeth, press her thighs, inspect her shoulders, chest, and neck. Every scar reduced her price. Every visible weakness determined her fate. Wooden plaques were hung around their necks: approximate age, place of origin, and whether they had previously given birth. Sometimes a single word could decide their future: fit for service or fit for pleasure. At that moment, a mother could be separated from her daughter, a sister from her sister, without real farewells. Screams were met with blows. Collapse was met with lashes. The market reeked of sweat, fear, blood, and the bidding cries that cared little whether the raised hand was buying a human or an animal. Roman law did not recognize a slave as a full human being. A slave was res, a thing, private property, and a female slave was double property, body and labor. Some women were purchased for domestic service, cooking, cleaning, raising children, but a significant portion were bought for a single purpose, unrecorded in contracts, yet known to all: sexual use. In large Roman houses, the first room a new female slave entered was the bath. She was forced to wash, sometimes completely shaved, perfumed, dressed in a thin garment not for modesty, but for display. Then she was pushed into a room where she knew no one and had no idea why she had been chosen. Refusal was not legally an option. Under the law of dominium, the master owned his slave's body as he owned the tools of his house. Rape of a female slave was not considered a crime, it was simply the treatment of one's property. But what the laws did not mention was what happened nightly behind closed doors. Many female slaves suffered daily abuse, not only by their masters, but by sons, guests, and even some mistresses driven by jealousy or sadism. A girl favored by her master became an enemy to the other women, secretly punished in ways more painful than public beatings. Whipping was the most common punishment, with leather lashes, wooden rods, or metal belts. Beatings were not just punishment, but daily reminders of hierarchy. A strike for being late. A strike for a dish displeasing the master. Sometimes, a strike for no reason other than the master's anger at something else. Some Roman historians, such as Seneca and Pliny the Elder, noted in their writings the cruelty endured by slaves in wealthy households, and mentioned that some masters used torture as psychological entertainment to vent their rage. But the body was not the only victim. Psychological humiliation left the deepest and longest-lasting scars. A female slave was forced to change her name to a Latin one, forbidden to speak her native language, scolded if she dared look her master in the eye, sometimes compelled to eat standing or on the floor before free people at the table. The goal was clear: to strip any sense of inner dignity. On Roman farms, women faced a death closer to a slow erosion. Work from sunrise to well past sunset fields, carrying heavy loads. Many worked while pregnant. Those who collapsed from exhaustion were often left untreated. Losing a female slave was not considered a major loss in the eyes of the masters. The markets were always full of replacements. Pregnancy was another nightmare. If a female slave bore a child of her master, the child was not considered legitimate, just a new piece of property. Some masters allowed the child to live as a slave. Others ordered the child killed at birth to avoid complications. Abortions were practiced using primitive and dangerous methods, poisonous herbs, violent pressure on the belly, or sharp tools, resulting in the deaths of countless girls without official records. In major cities, especially Rome itself, there were brothels owned by the state or private traders, employing only female slaves. Soldiers, travelers, and high-ranking officials frequented these places as a normal part of Roman life. Women had no right to refuse, no choice in who approached them, no right to stop even when ill. Those who weakened or caught disease were beaten instead of treated. In imperial palaces, the scene was more complex and dangerous. Slaves lived in apparent luxury, fine clothes, good food, clean rooms. But competition was deadly. One wrong look, an inappropriate word, or a hint of jealousy from the mistress could mean eternal disappearance. Palaces contained dungeons where accused slaves entered, many never to return. The law allowed a master to kill a slave without trial during many periods of Roman history, especially during the Republic. Under the Empire, some formal restrictions were imposed, but they were rarely enforced in favor of slaves. Escape was a dream for many, but nearly impossible. Cities were full of guards, informants, and spies. A runaway female slave, if caught, was publicly tortured, branded, or had a plaque hung around her neck, marking her as a traitor to her master, and then executed or returned to harsher servitude as a warning to others. Amid this daily hell, thousands of women lived and died without history recording their names. We know the stories of leaders, emperors, and philosophers, but we know only a fraction about those whose muffled screams built the empire. And we have yet to reach the darkest chapters of the story. At the heart of Rome, behind the gleaming marble facades, the majestic temples, and the statues that glorized justice and law, there existed another world, one that never appeared in inscriptions or speeches. A world that moved in the shadows, where the lives of thousands of women were managed as if they were mere numbers on silent lists. There, in the narrow alleys behind the markets, in houses that bore no signs, and in palaces whose walls were forbidden to approach, female slaves lived another chapter of suffering, a chapter never told publicly, yet known to all. The official brothels of Rome were no secret. They were part of the economic system itself. The state imposed taxes on their owners and registered the names of the women working in them, but those were not real names, only titles that faded with time. Most of the women there had not entered by choice. They were slaves purchased directly from the markets. A girl deemed unfit for domestic service, or whose body was judged more valuable than her physical strength, was sent straight to this fate. Their lives moved to a brutal, repetitive rhythm. Narrow rooms without windows, long waiting, then the entrance of a stranger, then another, then another. They were not allowed to refuse or object. The law did not see this as an assault, but as the legitimate use of property. Some Roman records indicate that in certain houses, a single woman would receive dozens of clients in one day. What body could endure that without breaking? Disease was a constant companion. Infectious illness, bleeding, fever. Treatment, however, was a luxury granted only if the slave was of high monetary value. The rest were left to recover on their own or to die, and those who died were dragged away at night and thrown beyond the city walls or into mass graves without names. There was an even more dangerous and cruel category: female slaves reserved for high-ranking guests, politicians, judges, and senior military officers. These women were prepared with extra care, trained in silence, conditioned to absolute obedience, and taught that any complaint could mean their immediate end. Some were transferred from one house to another, as if they were political gifts. But suffering was not confined to these places. Inside wealthy homes, another kind of hell existed, quieter, but far more lethal. Jealousy between Roman mistresses and female slaves was not merely emotional, it was a struggle for power. The slave who attracted special attention from the master entered a danger zone. She might be accused of theft without evidence, of lying without witness, or of attempted seduction, each leading to severe punishment. Punishments in these homes were not always public. Often, torture took place in closed rooms, away from the eyes of guests. Some mistresses inflicted punishment with their own hands. Roman history records the names of women notorious for extreme cruelty toward their slaves, so much so that some contemporary philosophers criticized these practices as excessive, savage, and inhuman. Instruments of torture were part of daily life in many houses. Iron collars worn around the neck for weeks at a time, short chains that forced the body into a constant stoop, confinement in narrow, lightless rooms for days on end, deprivation of food, and repeated flogging until the skin split open. These methods were not meant merely to punish, but to completely shatter the will. Branding with fire was among the most horrifying practices inflicted upon women. A metal tool was heated until it glowed red, then pressed against the skin to leave a permanent mark. Sometimes this mark was used to identify a rebellious slave, like the branding of an animal. Some historians noted that these brands were at times placed in visible areas, such as the neck or shoulder, to serve as a permanent warning to others. Inside the imperial palaces, where everything appeared calm and luxurious from the outside, the world was even more complex and dangerous. The female slaves there were not only numerous but were spread throughout networks of rooms, corridors, and wings accessible only to select individuals. Some were assigned to personal service, some to entertainment, and others to secret tasks that were never recorded. Jealousy within the palace was not confined to the mistresses, it thrived among the slaves themselves. Each woman knew that a single mistake could cast her into a worse fate, or into death. Rumors were used as weapons, and informing became a means of survival. The slave who reported another might survive temporarily, but the risk of disappearance was always present. Some palaces contained internal dungeons, not officially called prisons, but reserved for the confinement of slaves accused of serious offenses. Many who entered these places were never seen again. No trial, no appeal, just an internal decision carried out in silence. Perhaps the most psychologically devastating tool was isolation. A slave who was isolated for weeks or months without real human contact, without conversation, sometimes without light, often emerged as another person entirely broken, terrified, and terrifyingly obedient. And amid all this, there was another category of suffering, those forced to entertain at Rome's grand banquets. In those noisy feasts, where food, wine, and loud voices mixed, female slaves were compelled to dance, sing, and satisfy the desires of the guests. Assault in such settings was common, occurring openly, without objection, without punishment. Many of these women lost their lives because of such banquets, falling from high balconies, alcohol poisoning, or extreme violence from guests. And all that would be recorded in the registers was a cold sentence: a slave died while in service. Between the farms, the houses, the brothels, and the palaces, female slaves lived under the shadow of a law that did not protect them, and a society that considered their silence a virtue and their pain a normal condition. Roman society prided itself on its laws, its courts, and its administrative system, yet it turned a blind eye to one of its greatest daily crimes: the transformation of thousands of women into soulless tools. And yet, amid this dense darkness, small sparks sometimes flickered, sparks of resistance, attempts at rebellion, or moments of despair that erupted into sudden violence. Some women preferred death to continuation. Ancient texts recorded cases of slaves who threw themselves from rooftops or swallowed poisonous substances to escape a fate with no end. Death, in their eyes, was sometimes more merciful than a life without dignity or horizon. Others attempted murder. Servants who slipped poison into food, slaves who attacked their masters with knives, desperate attempts that often ended in gruesome executions, yet revealed something vital. The body may be enslaved, but the desire for freedom does not die easily. Despite all this violence, the Roman ruling class was keen to keep everything under control, preventing anything that might stir dangerous questions among the public. For that reason, stories were suppressed, testimonies were hidden, and names were erased. But despite every attempt at silence, some voices slipped through time. Letters from physicians describing bodies destroyed before their prime, hints from philosophers astonished by the master's savagery, rare funerary inscriptions referring to a suffering soul or a short life filled with hardship without stating the cause explicitly. All that we know today are fragments, remnants, shadows of an entire life of pain that was never allowed to speak. What makes this even more cruel is that the system was not an exception. It was the very heart of the Roman economy. Slaves built the roads, the palaces, and the temples. And female slaves, with their bodies and their lives, were part of the fuel that kept the empire vast and powerful for centuries. But just as everything in history has a peak, it also has the beginning of a collapse. At the end of this part of the story, we stand on the edge of a new phase, a phase in which some voices began to criticize, some laws began to change superficially, and some female slaves found slim chances of survival, not because the system had become merciful, but because its brutality had begun to exceed even Rome's ability to bear its consequences. In the next part, we will dive into attempts of rebellion, stories of murder inside homes, escape incidents that shook Roman society, and finally we will reach the most dangerous question of all. How did this terrifying system begin to collapse on the surface, and why have its true never disappeared, even to this day? At a certain moment in Rome's history, when the empire had reached the peak of its expansion and power, something hidden began to stir beneath the surface of that colossal structure. It was not an open rebellion at first, nor a revolution of swords, but a series of small cracks within the system itself, cracks carved by exhausted bodies and by souls that refused to die in silence. In the back alleys, in the kitchens, and in the narrow servants' quarters, whispers began to spread. Whispers between one slave and another about escape, about revenge, about poison, about the knife, about a single moment that might be worth an entire lifetime of suffering. These whispers were not organized, nor driven by ideology, but by pure despair, far more dangerous than any doctrine. The earliest incidents of female rebellion inside Roman households were not recorded under the name of revolt, but under the label of domestic crime. A slave girl kills her master in his sleep. Another sets the house ablaze at night. A third slips poison into the wine during a banquet. In the records, such incidents were always described as isolated, irrational acts without clear motives. Yet in truth, the motive was always the same: to return from the edge of nothingness at any cost. Some of these crimes truly shook Roman society. When a prominent noble was killed by a slave girl inside his palace, a collective decree was issued to execute all his slaves, men and women alike, as a form of collective punishment and a warning to the rest. This kind of collective retribution is documented in Roman history and reveals how the lives of slaves meant nothing in the face of the dignity of the master. Yet despite the brutal repression, the attempts did not cease. Escape remained a living dream nearly impossible, yet never dying. Some slave women took advantage of the chaos during civil wars or the great fires that broke out in Roman neighborhoods, fleeing through the smoke and the crowds. A few managed to disappear within the great cities, disguising themselves as free women, working under forged names, and living in constant fear that someone from their past might recognize them. In very rare cases, a slave woman was formally freed under what was known as the system of manumission. Some masters emancipated their female slaves for various reasons: a will made before death, an unofficial marriage, or even a belated sense of guilt. But freedom in such cases was never complete. The freed woman remained legally tied to her former master and indebted to him for loyalty and service upon request. Her freedom was incomplete, conditional, and fragile. And even after manumission, society did not forget. The stigma of slavery followed the woman wherever she went. Marriage to her was rarely desired. Full respect was seldom granted. She left the great prison, only to enter a social prison with no walls. Over time, some Roman voices began to criticize the system from within. Philosophers such as Seneca and moral writers of the Stoic school started to speak of slaves as human beings with feelings, not merely as tools. These voices did not call for the abolition of slavery, but they did call for the reduction of cruelty, the regulation of punishments, and the banning of certain forms of extreme torture. This was the beginning of change, but it was painfully slow and far too timid in the face of the immense tragedy. In the 1st century CE, the Roman state began to impose superficial restrictions on a master's right to kill directly. Killing a slave sometimes required a legal justification, and certain laws were introduced that, in rare cases, allowed a slave to file a complaint against excessive violence. Yet these laws largely remained ink on paper. Enforcement was weak, and real protection was nearly non-existent, especially for women. The greatest transformation came with the slow religious shift within the empire. With the spread of Christianity in later centuries, the concept of the human soul began to assert itself in moral discourse. Slavery was not abolished, but it became the subject of unprecedented ethical debate in Roman society. Even so, the system in its various forms continued for centuries more, even after the fall of Rome itself. As for the fate of most female slaves, it was rarely a dramatic ending worthy of memory. Most of them simply ended their lives through illness, exhaustion, a blow too severe, a failed childbirth, or premature old age in bodies that had never been allowed to be truly young. They were buried on the outskirts of cities, in nameless graves, without markers, without history. The few surviving documents do not tell us about their feelings, their dreams, or their true voices. They tell us only of short lifespans, depleted bodies, and prices of buying and selling as though history recorded possessions, not human beings. Rome, which we now admire in the images of its stunning ruins, its marble arches, and its paved roads whose traces still remain, was not built of stone alone. It was built upon the feet of slaves, upon the bodies of slave women, and upon the lifetimes of women who never chose this fate. When we walk today through the Colosseum, where the Romans once celebrated violence as entertainment, we must remember that behind every stone there is an unheard scream. Behind every statue there is the face of a woman never carved, and behind every line that glorifies Roman greatness, there are thousands of unwritten lines about the pain that forged that greatness. The harsh truth is that slavery was not a side mistake in the Roman system, it was part of its economic and social heart. It was essential to sustaining luxury, to feeding the upper classes, and to keeping the machinery of the empire endlessly turning. And women were the most brutally consumed fuel in that machine. Some may believe that these chapters ended with the fall of Rome, and that the world has left that dark age behind. But when we look deeply into the history of humanity, we discover that the forms of enslavement have changed, but they have not completely disappeared. Power remains, control remains, and the exploitation of the weak continues to take on different faces across the ages. The story of the slave women of Rome is not merely an ancient tale to be buried in the past. It is a mirror that shows us how far humanity can descend when moral restraints are lifted, and when the other is reduced to a thing in one's eyes. They left us no diaries, no letters, no testimonies, yet their traces remain in every corner of Roman history, in the roads, the palaces, the temples, and the cities that still stand today. Each one of them was, at some moment, a free child. She had a name, a mother, and a small private world of her own. Then one single day came and her life was turned into a number, a chain, and a long silence. This is the face that empires do not like to be seen, the face that is not carved on statues. the face that was written in blame, not in glory. And here, the story that history never wanted to tell comes to an end.